In early 1943, the Eastern Front was shaped by two overlapping realities: a major Soviet victory at Stalingrad in the south, and a long, grinding stalemate around the Rzhev-Vyazma salient in the center. For more than a year, this salient had projected eastward toward Moscow, putting German forces of Army Group Center within a few hundred kilometers of the Soviet capital, and tying down large Soviet formations in repeated offensives. Between January 1942 and March 1943, Soviet forces committed roughly 3.68 million personnel to operations in the wider Gzhatsk sector, facing about 1.66 million German troops. Losses on both sides were high, with estimates of Soviet casualties ranging from about 1.16 to 2.3 million, and German casualties around 668,000 for the entire period. The German Ninth Army, commanded by General Walter Model, held the eastern face of the salient. Its fortified positions, minefields, and interlocking fire zones had already resisted several large Soviet operations, including Operation Mars in late 1942. By the start of 1943, the Ninth Army was assessed as heavily worn in manpower and equipment, yet it still represented a coherent defensive force of approximately 300,000 men, about 100 tanks, and 400 artillery pieces in the salient itself. For German High Command, this salient was both an asset and a liability. It threatened Soviet communications around Moscow, but it also stretched supply lines and exposed key forces to possible encirclement. On the Soviet side, the overall strategic picture had changed after Stalingrad. The encirclement and destruction of the German Sixth Army in November 1942 to February 1943 encouraged the Stavka to plan further operations to reduce German salients and regain initiative along the entire front. In the central sector, the Western and Kalinin fronts, commanded by Ivan Konev until early February, and later Vasily Sokolovsky on Western Front and Maxim Purkayev on Kalinin Front, were tasked with eliminating the Rzhev-Vyazma bulge and, if possible, encircling major elements of Army Group Center. On February 6, 1943, the Soviet Supreme Command issued Directive No. 30,043, outlining a strategic offensive in the central sector. The plan envisioned coordinated attacks by the Western and Kalinin fronts to cut into the base of the salient, reach the Smolensk-Vyazma axis, and, in an optimal outcome, surround and destroy substantial parts of Army Group Center. According to later Soviet and Russian studies, the operation envisaged using about 870,000 troops from several combined arms armies, supported by 1st and 3rd Air Armies. The capture of nodes such as Rzhev, Gzhatsk, Vyazma, and Spas-Demensk was not just territorial. It was intended to disrupt German lateral rail communications and open the corridor towards Smolensk. At the same time, German strategic priorities were shifting. Adolf Hitler and the Oberkommando des Heeres were already considering a major summer offensive at Kursk and needed mobile reserves. Army Group Centers exposed salient near Rzhev constrained this flexibility. As early as January 1943, Model was instructed to prepare plans for a methodical withdrawal from the salient to a shorter, more defensible line further west. This plan became Operation Buffel, or Buffalo, a staged retreat scheduled for March 1st to 22nd, 1943, intended to pull Ninth Army out of its advanced positions, shorten the front by roughly 370 kilometers, and free as many as 21 divisions for later operations elsewhere. Both sides attempted to anticipate the other's intentions, but intelligence assessments were incomplete. Soviet reconnaissance and partisan reports in February observed German units pulling back artillery, evacuating supply depots, and preparing demolitions along roads and railways, suggesting preparations for withdrawal. However, these signs unfolded against a background of previous German local regroupings. and the Stavka pressed ahead with its offensive timetable, assuming there was still an opportunity to trap a significant German grouping if the offensive could be launched quickly and aggressively enough. For German command, the priority was to avoid a second Stalingrad in the center by preventing any deep Soviet penetration behind the salient's base while executing the retreat. The concept of Bufal therefore combined several elements: security sweeps against partisan activity before the withdrawal, systematic demolition of infrastructure to slow Soviet pursuit, and carefully timed disengagement from frontline positions to avoid gaps that could be exploited. The aim was not simply to abandon territory, but to trade space for time and manpower in a controlled fashion. For populations living inside the salient, the coming month promised another transformation. Years of occupation, requisitions, and previous offensives had already altered life in towns like Rzew, Gzhatsk, and Vyazma. As German authorities prepared to pull back, evacuation of administrative personnel, forced labour deportations, and planned demolitions of industrial and civilian infrastructure were set in motion. When the Soviet command studied these regions on maps and in staff documents, it counted rail junctions, river crossings, and road networks. For residents, the same features represented homes, workplaces, and the physical framework of daily survival. Thus, by the final days of February 1943, the central sector of the Eastern Front stood on the threshold of a major reconfiguration. The Soviet leadership sought to leverage the momentum gained at Stalingrad to inflict a decisive blow on Army Group Center and move the front line westward towards Smolensk. German command, facing stretched resources and pressure on multiple fronts, aimed to preserve combat power through a controlled withdrawal, while denying the Red Army the encirclement it planned. The Gzhatsk axis, one of the main directions of the Western Front's coming offensive, would become a key test of whether the Soviet plan could convert tactical success into an operational encirclement, or whether Model's withdrawal would preserve the core of Army Group Center for future operations. On March 1st, 1943, Army Group Center began implementing Operation Büffel in the Rzhev salient. The German 9th Army, with roughly 300,000 personnel, about 100 tanks, and 400 artillery pieces in the sector, received timed orders to vacate forward positions and fall back to a prepared line running through Dukovshchina, Dorogobuzh, and Spars-Demensk. The withdrawal schedule divided formations into phased echelons. Forward battalions disengaged first under night cover, followed by main regimental forces and finally rearguard detachments, which were tasked with mining routes, demolishing bridges, and maintaining the appearance of continuous resistance as long as possible. Above Model's 9th Army, Army Group Center's headquarters under General Günther von Kluge supervised the operation with the explicit intention of avoiding any encirclement comparable to Stalingrad. Corps headquarters coordinated lateral movements so that gaps did not open between withdrawing divisions. Signals and logistics units were among the first to redeploy toward the new line, ensuring that supply depots, field hospitals, and artillery ammunition stocks would be available as the infantry and armour arrived. The withdrawal also required careful traffic regulation on a limited road network, as horse-drawn transport columns, motorised supply units, and combat vehicles shared thawing spring roads. On the Soviet side, the opening phase of the Rzhev-Vyazma offensive overlapped with the German retreat. The Western Front, whose operational concept had been shaped earlier by Colonel General Ivan Konev and was now executed under Colonel General Vasily Sokolovsky, deployed multiple combined arms armies along the line from north of Rzhev to south of Gzhatsk. The 5th Army faced Gzhatsk, with mobile detachments formed around tank battalions, ski troops, and aerosled units designated to exploit any breach. To its south and north, neighbouring armies were to advance on Sychevka, Bely, and Vyazma, creating converging axes towards Smolensk. Soviet reconnaissance units and partisans had already reported unusual German activity in the last week of February. Artillery being pulled back from front positions, depots evacuated, and engineering work around bridges and road junctions. These observations led to staff discussions at Western and Kalinin fronts, but the Stavka's existing plan still assumed a frontal offensive against a largely static German defence. As a result, the initial orders issued on the 1st to 2nd of March framed operations as an advance into enemy positions, rather than a high-speed pursuit of withdrawing forces. On March 2nd, as German units completed the first stage of their withdrawal, Soviet frontline armies began probing attacks along a broad front. In several sectors, forward detachments discovered empty trenches and abandoned bunkers rather than active resistance. The Kalinin Front's 39th and 30th armies were ordered to increase their tempo, and at 17:15 on 2 March, a Stavka directive instructed both Kalinin and Western fronts to shift from preparatory actions to full-scale advance. This change formally marked the transition from a planned offensive into what would become a race to catch a retreating opponent. On the morning of March 3rd, Soviet troops of the 30th Army entered Gzhatsk without facing organised opposition. German main forces had already crossed to their next lines during the night. Western Front's formations pushed westward along parallel routes, seeking to close on Olenino, Gzhatsk, and the approaches to Vyazma. The 5th Army organised reconnaissance groups with tanks, ski infantry, and aerosleds to move ahead of the main rifle divisions, an arrangement intended to find weak spots and seize intact bridges before German demolition teams could act. For the German troops, the opening days of Büfel combined movement with security operations. Rearguards received instructions to conduct bandit-fighting sweeps against suspected partisan bases before leaving each sector. In practice, this meant searches of villages, arrests and deportations of able-bodied civilians for labour, alongside destruction of barns, food stores and shelters that could support Soviet irregulars. These measures were folded into the same timetable that governed the withdrawal of infantry and artillery, creating a sequence in which an area was swept, stripped of resources, mined, and then abandoned. For Soviet units entering the vacated zones, the immediate impression was of terrain systematically prepared to slow them. Roads were cratered, rail tracks dismantled in sections, and river crossings destroyed. Minefields remained in front of old German positions, posing risks even where no defenders stayed behind. Reports from advancing rifle divisions in early March noted that progress was limited to roughly 6 to 7 kilometers per day, on many sectors, constrained by demolitions, mud, and the need to bring up artillery and supply columns along damaged routes. Within this opening phase, Gzhatsk emerged as one of Western Front's key objectives. Situated on the Gzhat River and astride important lateral roads between Vyazma and Mozhaisk, the town functioned as both a tactical strongpoint and a logistical node in the former German line. As Fifth Army's mobile detachments and rifle formations moved westward after March 3rd, they encountered scattered German rearguards and extensive demolitions rather than cohesive defensive belts in front of the town. After several days of pursuit and local engagements, Soviet forces took control of Gzhatsk by March 6th, securing another step in the advance toward the new German defensive line. Strategic planning for the March 1943 operations on the central sector reflected different starting points for each side. For the Soviet command, the Western and Kalinin fronts formed one segment of a broader winter-spring strategy to exploit the success at Stalingrad, reduce German salience, and press the front line westward. Stavka directives framed the Rzhev-Vyazma region as an area where a successful offensive might not only eliminate a long-standing threat to Moscow, but also open a corridor towards Smolensk. Operational studies outlined the possibility, under favourable conditions, of cutting off a large grouping of German forces between Vyazma and Smolensk if rapid advances could converge on key rail junctions. Within Western Front, the plan assigned leading roles to 5th Army on the Gzhatsk axis and neighbouring formations to the north and south, including 33rd and 49th Armies, with 10th Army covering more southern sectors. Each army was reinforced with attached tank brigades, self-propelled artillery regiments, and engineer units equipped for river crossings and mine clearance. Artillery density on breakthrough sectors was planned at several dozen guns and mortars per kilometre of front, including 122mm and 152mm howitzers and Guards mortar regiments. Air support from 1st Air Army was organised to provide fighter cover over advancing spearheads and to interdict German retreat routes, although available aircraft had to be shared with other sectors. The Soviet plan assumed that German forces in the salient were weakened by previous battles and supply difficulties, but still capable of organised defence. As a result, the offensive concept emphasised methodical breakthrough tactics, concentrated artillery preparation, infantry assault in multiple echelons, and then commitment of mobile groups, tank brigades and cavalry or ski units to exploit gaps. Staff calculations projected possible advances of 8 to 12 kilometres per day in favourable conditions. However, these estimates rested on several variables: road capacity in thaw conditions, ammunition stockpiles, fuel availability for tanks and trucks, and the state of units that had already been engaged in continuous operations over the winter. On the German side, planning for Operation Buffel proceeded from a different set of priorities. Army Group Centre sought to preserve combat power, reduce front length, and free up divisions for future offensive or defensive tasks elsewhere. Model's 9th Army staff mapped a withdrawal route that would successively abandon forward positions, intermediate strongpoints, and finally the entire salient, consolidating on a shorter line anchored on more favourable terrain west of the Vyazma-Smolensk axis. The timing of each phase was calibrated so that Soviet forces, once they detected the withdrawal, would encounter successive mined roadblocks and rearguard positions rather than isolated units that could be enveloped. German engineers played a central role in this planning. Detailed demolition schedules prioritized bridges over the Volga, Vazusa, and Gzhat rivers, rail junctions, and key road intersections. Stocks of explosives and mines were moved forward in February to ensure rearguard units could implement demolitions under time pressure. Anti-partisan provisions were formally integrated into Buffel. Before leaving each area, security battalions and field gendarmerie were to conduct searches, deport selected civilians for labour, destroy food stocks that could support partisans, and burn settlements designated as potential bases for resistance. These measures aimed to delay the restoration of Soviet control and complicate logistic use of reclaimed territory. Intelligence and misperception influenced both plans. Soviet frontline staffs received partial indications of German preparations to withdraw, such as reduced artillery fire, movement of supply columns westward, and increased demolition activity. But these were initially interpreted within the framework of a possible local regrouping, rather than a full evacuation of the salient. This contributed to the decision to maintain a timetable geared toward breaking fortified lines, rather than immediately reorganizing for a pursuit operation, emphasizing speed and depth. For German command, the main concern was that Soviet forces might recognize the withdrawal early, bypass prepared blocking positions, and attempt deep penetrations towards Smolensk or the Dnieper crossings, turning an orderly retreat into a costly disengagement under pressure. Propaganda on both sides reflected strategic aims. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts framed upcoming operations in the central sector as part of a continuous advance after Stalingrad, emphasizing the liberation of occupied towns and the expectation of further progress toward pre-war borders. German communications to troops and the home front portrayed Buffel as an example of flexible planned maneuver, stressing that the abandonment of the salient was a rational step to shorten the line and improve defensive strength rather than a defeat. This messaging aimed to maintain morale among German soldiers who were leaving long-held positions and among civilians learning of another territorial contraction on the Eastern Front. Behind these public statements, both sides faced constraints that shaped their planning, but were less visible in official narratives. Soviet formations had to cope with worn-out transport, shortages of motor fuel, and limited capacity of rail lines feeding the Western and Kalinin fronts from the rear. German units, while benefiting from a shortened front, were operating with reduced manpower in infantry companies, increasing reliance on artillery and remaining armoured vehicles to compensate. The strategic goals, encirclement and liberation on one side, controlled withdrawal and force preservation on the other, were clearly defined on paper, but their realization would depend on how well each command could manage these material and organizational limits once the withdrawal and the offensive fully intersected. The first days of March 1943 brought a series of overlapping movements rather than a single, clearly defined battle line. As German units of 9th Army began pulling out of their forward defences in the Rezerv-Vyazma salient, Soviet formations of Western and Kalinin fronts advanced into positions that had been prepared for heavy resistance, but often found only rear guards and abandoned works. The clash in this phase was therefore defined less by frontal assaults on entrenched positions and more by local engagements as Soviet forward detachments attempted to close with retreating German columns and rearguard screens. Along the Gzhatsk axis, 5th Army pushed westward from its start positions, advancing through former German trench systems, dugouts and mine belts. Engineer units moved ahead to clear passages, marking safe lanes for infantry and vehicles. In some sectors, Soviet rifle regiments reported advancing several kilometers on March 3rd to 4th without encountering organized fire, then suddenly coming under mortar and machine gun attacks from small German groups positioned on ridges or in forest edges. These rearguard elements were tasked with delaying the Soviet advance long enough for the main German forces and supply columns to gain distance toward the new line. On secondary axes, north and south of Gzhatsk, the pattern was similar. Kalinin Front's 30th and 30th 9th Armies, moving into the northern part of the former salient, met sporadic resistance around road junctions and river crossings. German units used local strongpoints, such as villages with stone buildings or wooded heights, to stage short fights before withdrawing. As Soviet units deployed artillery to suppress these positions, German forces pulled back again, leaving minefields and destroyed bridges behind them. The engagements were typically measured in platoons and companies, rather than divisions, but their cumulative effect was to limit the daily rate of Soviet advance. For Soviet soldiers who had previously fought in costly frontal attacks against the reserve defences, the initial encounters of March felt different. Instead of crossing open ground under continuous heavy fire, they found empty trenches, wrecked bunkers, and depots stripped of usable material. Yet the absence of a fixed front presented its own challenges. It was no longer clear where the main enemy line lay, how far the retreat would go, or at what point German forces would turn and offer determined resistance. Commanders at regimental and divisional level had to balance orders to move forward quickly with the need to maintain cohesion, avoid ambushes, and preserve ammunition for engagements that might develop beyond the next demolished bridge or mined crossroads. Civilian populations experienced this phase as a rapid transition. In villages and towns abandoned by German authorities, residents emerged to find burned documents, destroyed telephone exchanges, and depots emptied or fired. Some encountered Soviet reconnaissance patrols hours after the last German rearguards had departed. Others remained in areas where German detachments were still conducting anti-partisan sweeps. In locations earmarked for destruction under Buffel's directives, buildings were burned or demolished, and able-bodied inhabitants were taken westward in columns as forced labourers. For these civilians, the first contacts with Soviet troops often coincided with the immediate aftermath of such demolitions and deportations. In the air, the first days of March saw intensified reconnaissance and limited strikes rather than large-scale air battles. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft flew low-level missions to locate columns on roads leading west from Rzhev, Gzhatsk, and Sychevka, reporting the movement of motor transport, horse-drawn wagons, and artillery. Where weather permitted, bombers and ground attack aircraft attempted to hit bridges and choke points. But the combination of spring haze, limited daylight, and German concealment measures reduced the effectiveness of these early efforts. German fighter units, operating from airfields further west, focused on covering key crossings and disrupting Soviet reconnaissance rather than maintaining a continuous presence over the withdrawing columns. Artillery engagements in this phase reflected the changing nature of the front. Soviet batteries, brought forward onto ground recently held by German forces, fired mainly on suspected assembly areas and the road intersections ahead of the advancing infantry. The absence of clearly defined German trench lines made registration more difficult. Many missions were based on limited targeting data and produced harassing rather than decisive fire. German artillery, in turn, shifted from pre-registered barrage patterns in front of fixed defences to short, concentrated fires from temporary positions, intended to break up Soviet attempts to bridge streams or compress columns on exposed roads before being limbered up and moved again. The cumulative result of these first engagements was a mutual adjustment rather than a clear victory for either side. German forces succeeded in maintaining a controlled withdrawal, delaying Soviet units at selected points without becoming decisively engaged. Soviet forces, for their part, advanced steadily westward, occupying important locations such as Rzhev and then Gzhatsk, and reducing the depth of the former salient. However, the tempo of their progress, constrained by demolitions, terrain, and the need to build up logistics in newly recovered territory, fell short of the speed that would have been required to overtake the main body of Ninth Army and initiate a large-scale encirclement in this early phase of the campaign. As Soviet forces pushed beyond Gzhatsk after March 6th, the operation entered a phase in which the expanding front and rising attrition began to test both commands. Western Front's armies advanced on a broad arc. Fifth Army moved west and southwest from Gzhatsk, toward the line of Yartsevo and Vyazma. 33rd and 49th Armies pressed forward from more southerly sectors, and adjacent formations to the north tried to align with Kalinin Front's progress. Each new kilometre of ground gained extended supply lines and required additional troops for flank security and local garrisons, even as rifle divisions were being reduced by casualties and fatigue. In many rifle divisions, battalions that had started the month at 500 to 600 men found themselves reduced to 250 to 350 by mid-March due to combat, illness, and non-battle losses on difficult terrain. Regiment-level reports recorded daily losses in dozens or low hundreds, often from mines and artillery rather than close combat. Tank brigades, committed to support the most promising advances, saw operational strengths fluctuate as vehicles were lost to mechanical breakdowns or became immobilized in mud even when not destroyed by enemy fire. Fuel consumption rose as units maneuvered on poor roads and detoured around craters and demolished bridges. For the Soviet command, escalation expressed itself in the need to commit reserves earlier than planned. Fifth Army received additional artillery and anti-tank units to support its push beyond Gzhatsk, while higher headquarters considered whether to release front-level tank formations to exploit perceived openings in the German line. Each such reinforcement decision had to weigh the potential gain of deeper penetration against the risk of dispersing armoured forces across multiple, partially developed axes. Staff maps showed arrows converging on Vyazma and further west. Field reports, however, described the slowing pace of advance as formations encountered new German blocking positions on rivers and ridge lines. German forces experienced escalation in the form of rising pressure on rear guards and increased demands on logistics. As Ninth Army's main body approached the new defensive line, corps and division staffs had to decide where to halt and fight and where to continue withdrawing. Rearguard battalions, sometimes reinforced with assault guns or a handful of tanks, were ordered to hold key crossings until specific times, often under conditions of limited ammunition and with only partial information on Soviet proximity. Casualty reports from these units recorded steady losses in infantry sections and company officers, even as the main formations preserved much of their equipment by avoiding encirclement and large-scale engagements. Terrain and weather amplified the crisis for both sides. March thaw turned many secondary roads into deep mud, restricting motor traffic and forcing columns onto a limited number of usable routes. Soviet supply units struggled to bring forward artillery ammunition and fuel, relying heavily on horse-drawn transport, where trucks could not pass. German columns likewise were constrained by the same conditions, creating vulnerable traffic jams at river crossings and road junctions. Air reconnaissance observed these choke points, but low clouds and frequent precipitation reduced the ability of either side to deliver sustained air attacks. Command challenges multiplied as the front line became more fluid. Soviet Army headquarters had to coordinate advances over increasingly wide sectors, sometimes relying on incomplete radio communications and delayed liaison reports. Misalignment between neighboring armies could leave open flanks or congested sectors, where multiple formations attempted to use the same roads. German headquarters, for their part, faced the problem of synchronizing the arrival of withdrawing divisions with the readiness of the new defensive positions. Units that reached the line earlier than planned might lack prepared trenches or fields of fire. Those arriving later risked being caught on the move if Soviet forces managed to close the distance more quickly than anticipated. Political expectations added another layer of tension. Soviet leadership viewed the reduction of the Vyazma salient as both a military and symbolic objective, demonstrating that the Central Front, like the Stalingrad sector, could produce significant gains. Reports to Moscow highlighted liberated towns and kilometers advanced, reinforcing the perception of continuous progress. At the same time, field commanders were aware that the main German group had not been cut off, and that pursuing a retreating enemy over damaged infrastructure carried its own risks. German political authorities, informed of the withdrawal, monitored whether Büffel would avoid a repeat of Stalingrad. Senior officers understood that heavy losses in personnel or equipment during the retreat would carry implications beyond the operational level. By the middle of March, the escalation of the campaign had thus produced a dual crisis. For Soviet forces, the challenge of sustaining an offensive over extended distances with tired formations and strained logistics. For German forces, the danger that delays, local setbacks, or miscalculations might expose parts of Ninth Army to encirclement or breakthrough before the new defensive line was fully established. The next phase would hinge on how each side adapted its methods, whether Soviet units could convert territorial gains into deeper operational penetration, and whether German command could transform a planned withdrawal into a stable front without ceding more ground than intended. By the second week of March 1943, the Gzhatsk axis formed one segment of a wider peak in operations, as Soviet forces attempted to press beyond the former salient and close on Vyazma and the new German defensive line. Western Front's Fifth Army, having taken Gzhatsk on March 6th, organized its rifle divisions and mobile detachments into a series of advancing echelons. Forward groups of tanks, ski battalions, and aerosled units moved along the more passable roads and frozen tracks, followed by infantry regiments and artillery. By 12th March, combined forces from 5th and 33rd Armies, including the 144th Rifle Division, 3rd Guards Motorized Rifle Division, and 110th Rifle Division, entered Vyazma, marking the capture of another key node on the former German line. This advance was part of a broader offensive in which the Vyazma strategic operation of 1943 committed approximately 876,000 Soviet troops from Western and Kalinin fronts. Their task at this peak phase was twofold: to consolidate gains in liberated towns and to attempt deeper penetration towards Smolensk and the Orlov-Bryansk sectors. To achieve this, the Stavka released 1st and 5th Tank Corps to support continued attacks in the second half of March. These corps were intended to break through the new German line across the base of the former salient and cut communications between Army Group Center's central and southern groupings. In several days of fighting against newly occupied German positions, they lost 132 tanks, a figure that illustrates the intensity of these attempts and the resilience of the re-established German defense. For German forces, the peak of the campaign coincided with the final stages of Operation Büffel. Between the 1st and 22nd of March, 9th Army and elements of 4th Army completed the withdrawal from the Rzhev salient to the Dorogobuzh-Spas-Demensk line, shortening the front by about 230 miles and freeing 21 divisions for later use. Operational reports for March show German losses in the 4th and 9th Armies at around 15,267 personnel killed, wounded and missing during this period, while Soviet forces engaged in the Rzhev-Vyazma offensive suffered about 38,862 irrecoverable and 99,715 sanitary casualties, totaling 138,577 point. These comparative figures highlight that the German command largely achieved its aim of evacuating the salient without a major encirclement, while Soviet forces bore higher losses in the process of pursuit and assault on the new line. On the ground, this phase saw some of the most concentrated fighting of the operation. As Soviet units approached the Dukovshchina-Dorogobuzh-Spas-Demensk line, they encountered not mobile rear guards, but divisions already dug in behind minefields, anti-tank ditches, and pre-sighted artillery positions. German infantry, supported by assault guns and field artillery, used ridgelines, forest edges, and riverbanks to establish successive belts of defense. Soviet tank corps attempting to force these positions often had to attack along narrow corridors where engineers had cleared mines, exposing them to concentrated anti-tank fire from pack guns and self-propelled guns deployed in depth. The decision-making environment at high command level reflected this shift. For the Soviet side, reports from 5th and 33rd Armies in mid-March emphasized increasing resistance, rising tank and infantry losses, and stretching supply lines. Stavka representatives on Western Front assessed whether continuing to commit armoured reserves against the new German line would produce sufficient operational gain or simply drain formations needed elsewhere. For the German side, Model and Army Group Centre staff monitored the rate at which Soviet units approached the new positions, adjusting artillery and reserve deployment to reinforce sectors that appeared at greater risk of breakthrough. Civilian suffering reached a high point during and immediately after this phase. The German withdrawal was accompanied by large-scale security operations and scorched earth measures. Preceding and during Büffel, security sweeps under the doctrine of Bandenbekämpfung resulted in the killing of an estimated 3,000 local inhabitants, with inventories showing relatively few weapons seized in comparison to the number of people killed. In the towns of Rzhev, Gzhatsk, and Vyazma, post-liberation reports recorded extensive destruction. In Vyazma, 51 of 5,500 pre-war buildings remained. In Gzhatsk, 300 of 1,600. In Rzhev, 500 of 5,400. Some 15,000 people were deported from these three towns alone. Rural districts showed similar patterns, with more than half of villages in some areas burned. For civilians, the peak of the campaign meant not only a change of front line, but the loss of housing, infrastructure, and in many cases, family members through deportation or killing. For soldiers on both sides, this phase combined intensive combat, with the cumulative strain of prolonged operations. Soviet rifle companies attacking the new line often did so with reduced strengths, while German infantry units, though preserved from encirclement, remained below nominal establishment after earlier campaigns. Medical services on each side had to cope with increased flows of wounded over damaged transport networks. Artillery ammunition and fuel consumption peaked as both commands tried to impose their will on the new defensive belt. Soviet forces to break through it, German forces to stabilize and hold it. By the last third of March, these pressures produced a situation where territorial change slowed significantly even as casualties continued to accumulate. The front line, now considerably west of its position at the start of the month, had hardened along the newly prepared German defences. Soviet offensives still probed for weaknesses, and local attacks continued along the Gzhatsk-Vyazma-Dorogobuj sector. But the concentrated efforts of mid-March had not produced the deep penetration necessary to envelop major portions of Army Group Center. Instead, the peak of the campaign crystallized into a stabilized line that would frame the next stage of operations and debates within both commands about the limits and possibilities of further offensive action in this region. Adaptation to the new situation began even before the last German units completed their withdrawal. By 22nd March 1943, 9th Army had reached the Dukovshchina-Dorogobuj-Spars-Demensk line, and Soviet Western and Kalinin fronts had effectively eliminated the Rzhev salient, advancing some 130 to 160 kilometers westward, and taking towns including Gzhatsk, Sikevka, Bely, and Vyazma. Yet the main German group had escaped encirclement. Both commands now began to adjust from a phase of rapid movement to one of consolidation, probing, and preparation for future operations. For the Soviet side, one form of resistance was the effort to sustain offensive pressure despite growing fatigue. Army and front staffs revised orders to emphasize limited objective attacks, reconnaissance in force, and localized attempts to improve positions rather than continuous large-scale assaults along the entire front. Rifle divisions were instructed to strengthen captured lines with new trenches, foxholes, and anti-tank obstacles, while maintaining small mobile detachments to test the depth of German defences. Where the advance had outrun artillery and supply echelons, commanders temporarily halted major attacks until ammunition and fuel stocks could be brought forward over repaired rail lines and reconstructed bridges. Tank and mechanized formations also adapted. After the losses suffered by 1st and 5th Tank Corps in attempts to breach the new German line, higher headquarters placed greater emphasis on reconnaissance of anti-tank defences before committing large groups of vehicles. In practice, this meant increased use of small tank groups and attached infantry to probe for gun concentrations and mine belts, while engineers experimented with different methods of clearing lanes under fire. These adjustments did not remove the basic constraints imposed by terrain and weather, but they reflected a shift from the earlier expectation of rapid breakthrough to a more cautious approach suited to attacking a prepared defensive belt. German adaptation centered on transforming the shortened front into a stable defensive system. Once divisions reached their assigned sectors, engineers and infantry worked to deepen positions, building dugouts, trench networks, and communication trenches, laying new minefields, and integrating field fortifications with natural features such as rivers and forests. Artillery units registered new firing data on likely Soviet assembly areas and approach routes. Army and Corps staffs reviewed the performance of rearguard tactics during Buffel, recording which combinations of temporary strongpoints, demolitions, and fire plans had been most effective in delaying Soviet pursuit without incurring excessive losses. At the same time, Army Group Center began reassigning the divisions freed by the elimination of the salient. According to German and later secondary accounts, the retreat released 1 Army headquarters, 4 Corps headquarters, and around 21 divisions, 15 infantry, 2 motorized, 3 panzer, and 1 cavalry for future employment, contributing to the reserve that would later be used for summer operations around Kursk. Within the remaining front line, this allowed for some rotation of exhausted units out of first echelon positions and for the creation of modest local reserves capable of counter-attacking any Soviet penetrations. Partisan activity and anti-partisan measures formed another layer of resistance and adaptation. In the wider Smolensk region, earlier operations had already seen partisan detachments numbering tens of thousands. These groups now operated in territory that had just been traversed by retreating German columns and advancing Soviet troops. Partisans worked to repair roads and communications for Soviet use, gathered information on German positions beyond the new line, and assisted local administrations in re-establishing basic services. German security commands in turn intensified efforts to disrupt these networks in the rear of the new front, using patrols, cordon and search operations, and intelligence measures to identify and suppress partisan bases. For civilians, adaptation meant reconstructing life in areas twice devastated, first by prolonged occupation, then by scorched earth withdrawal. In towns such as Konev, Gzhatsk, and Vyazma, where thousands of buildings had been destroyed and many residents deported, local Soviet authorities organized emergency housing in surviving structures, set up field kitchens, and began clearing debris from streets and rail lines. Agricultural work had to resume despite shortages of draft animals, tools, and seed. Village councils coordinated the redistribution of remaining livestock and equipment. Civilian resistance thus expressed itself in basic survival tasks: rebuilding homes, restoring fields, and re-establishing schools and clinics in damaged or improvised premises. The psychological dimension of adaptation was evident among soldiers on both sides. Soviet troops, aware of the distance advanced since the start of the operation and the liberation of heavily damaged towns, also recognized that the hoped-for encirclement of major German forces had not occurred. Letters and reports recorded a mixture of satisfaction at pushing the front westward and fatigue from repeated offensives with limited operational results. German soldiers, having avoided encirclement and reached prepared positions, nonetheless had to adjust to the continuing westward movement of the front and to the knowledge that the territory they had defended for more than a year was now lost. Both commands drew lessons from the March fighting. Soviet planners studied the timing of their reaction to the German withdrawal, the tempo of their pursuit, and the performance of logistics over devastated terrain. German staffs analyzed which aspects of Büffel, preparatory security sweeps, demolition schedules, rear guard deployment, had been most decisive in preventing Soviet forces from overtaking Ninth Army. These lessons would inform subsequent operations. For the Soviets in planning later 1943 offensives towards Smolensk, for the Germans in considering further withdrawals or defensive rearrangements elsewhere on the Eastern Front. By the end of March, resistance and adaptation had produced a new equilibrium. The salient that had dominated the Central Front since early 1942 no longer existed. In its place stood a shortened German line, a Soviet front that had moved significantly westward but was again facing prepared defences, and a devastated region in which civilians, partisans, and returning administrators worked to restore basic structures of life. The next developments would depend on whether either side could convert the lessons of this operation into a decisive change in the balance of forces in the months to come. The turning point of the March 1943 campaign on the Gzhatsk-Vyazma axis did not occur in a single dramatic battle, but in a series of cumulative decisions and realizations on both sides during the second half of the month. By then, the structural conditions that had given rise to hopes of a deep Soviet penetration and a possible encirclement of parts of Army Group Center had changed. Operation Büffel had largely run its course, the main German forces had reached their new defensive positions, and the offensive momentum of Western and Kalinin fronts was increasingly constrained by fatigue and logistics. On the Soviet side, the first sign of this shift was the changing content of front-level reports. In early March, summaries emphasized kilometers gained and the capture of towns such as Rzew, Gzhatsk, and Vyazma. By mid-March, they focused more on resistance encountered along the Dukovshchina-Dorogobuj-Spars-Demensk line, rising losses in attacking units, and difficulties in bringing up ammunition and fuel. Divisional commanders described attacks that advanced a few hundred meters under heavy fire, then halted as infantry companies ran low on grenades or artillery preparation could not be sustained. Requests for reinforcements increasingly concerned replacement personnel and artillery shells rather than additional tank units for exploitation. At Stavka and Western Front headquarters, staff officers compared these reports with the original operational concept drafted after Stalingrad. The idea of converging thrusts towards Smolensk and deeper into the rear of Army Group Center had rested on two assumptions: that German forces in the Rzew salient would resist in place long enough to be fixed and possibly cut off, and that Soviet armies could maintain a high tempo of advance once a breakthrough was achieved. By the third week of March, neither condition was fully present. The main German formations had executed a withdrawal earlier and more systematically than expected, and the Soviet advance, though territorially significant, had slowed as it approached the new line. Within German command, the turning point appeared in a different form. In the transition from a time-limited withdrawal operation to a more conventional defensive posture. Once the last major columns of Ninth Army cleared the former salient and occupied prepared sectors, Model and his staff shifted their focus from timing demolitions and rearguard actions to stabilizing the new front. Situation maps that previously showed arrows indicating withdrawal routes were updated with solid lines marking regimental and divisional sectors. Corps reserves were positioned behind likely Soviet axes of attack, and attention turned to the allocation of freed divisions to other sectors of the Eastern Front. At the tactical level, Soviet attempts to push beyond the newly occupied German line produced several local penetrations that were then contained or reduced. In some sectors, rifle units managed to cross minor rivers or seize sections of forest, but found themselves exposed to concentrated artillery and counterattacks from infantry and assault guns. Tank brigades that had earlier advanced over relatively open ground now operated in corridors defined by mine-clearing lanes and terrain obstacles, limiting their ability to maneuver. Reports from these sectors noted that attacks could still gain ground, but rarely achieved the depth needed to disrupt German operational reserves or communications. For troops in the line, the change was perceptible in the rhythm of operations. Soviet soldiers who had spent days moving westward through abandoned positions and fighting short engagements with rear guards now confronted continuous trench systems and regular artillery barrages. Night marches gave way to extended periods in forward foxholes, preparing for set-piece attacks. German soldiers, who had experienced the strain of retreat and the uncertainty of whether they might be overtaken, began to record more static conditions. Regular fire tasks, familiar terrain, and clearer boundaries between units. Civilian experience also reflected the turning point. In the first half of March, the front had passed rapidly through many settlements, leaving behind destruction and scattered groups of people unsure whether the fighting would return. As the line stabilized in the second half of the month, local authorities could begin more systematic registration of residents, distribution of food, and restoration of rudimentary administration. The immediate danger of being caught between moving fronts lessened, even if the underlying risks of bombardment and renewed offensives remained. Politically and strategically, the recognition that the opportunity for a large encirclement had passed emerged gradually, rather than in a single directive. Soviet leaders could point to the elimination of the Rzew-Vyazma salient and the advance of 130 to 160 kilometers as confirmation that the front had moved significantly westward since the previous year. At the same time, Internal assessments acknowledged that the main formations of Army Group Center remained intact and that German command had gained a shorter, more defensible line while preserving divisions for future operations. German authorities, for their part, could present Boeufel as a successful maneuver that exchanged territory for reduced front length and freed reserves, while privately noting the loss of a forward base that had once threatened Moscow. By late March, the pattern of daily events confirmed that the decisive moment of the operation had already passed. Soviet attacks continued, but they tended to be localized, aiming to straighten sectors of the line, or seize tactically advantageous positions rather than to break through to operational depth. German countermeasures concentrated on holding the new front and preparing for expected future offensives, including those anticipated in the summer. The turning point of the Gzhatsk breakthrough, therefore, lay in the convergence of these developments: the completion of the German withdrawal without encirclement and the culmination of the Soviet offensive at a new defensive line that could be breached only at considerable additional cost. By the final days of March 1943, the operational tempo along the Gzhatsk-Vyazma sector had slowed to a pattern of localized engagements rather than large-scale assaults. Western and Kalinin fronts continued to launch limited attacks and reconnaissance in force against the Dukovshchina-Dorogobuj-Spas-Demensk line. But these actions resulted in marginal shifts of the front rather than a breakthrough. Orders from Stavka and front headquarters increasingly emphasized consolidation of positions, rotation of exhausted units to the rear, and preparation for future operations towards Smolensk rather than immediate continuation of deep offensive thrusts. For Soviet rifle divisions and tank brigades, the end of this operation meant a transition from continuous advance to holding newly gained ground. Units that had fought from early March were pulled back to second echelon when possible to reorganize, integrate replacements, repair weapons, and redistribute surviving equipment. Medical services attempted to clear accumulated casualties from frontline aid posts and field hospitals, moving wounded eastward along repaired roads and rail lines. Engineering units shifted from emergency bridge repairs and mine clearance in the wake of the retreating Germans to more systematic reconstruction of crossings, roads and defensive works in the new Soviet forward zone. On the German side, completion of Operation Boeufel by 22nd March left 9th Army and parts of 4th Army deployed along the shortened front. Corps and division headquarters submitted final reports on the withdrawal, cataloguing material left behind, ammunition expended, and casualties incurred. The newly established positions were organized into sectors with clearly defined responsibilities and artillery support plans. Freed higher formations and divisions began to move by rail and road to other sectors of the Eastern Front, forming part of the operational reserve later involved in planning for the summer offensive around Kursk. In the Gzhatsk-Vyazma region itself, remaining German forces focused on improving fortifications, reinforcing minefields, and conducting patrols to monitor Soviet activity. For civilians, the end of combat operations in March did not mean an immediate restoration of pre-war conditions, but the beginning of a humanitarian crisis under new authorities. In towns such as Zhev, Gzhatsk, and Vyazma, the combined effect of prolonged fighting and the German scorched earth policy left most buildings destroyed or uninhabitable. Post-liberation surveys reported hundreds of structures standing where thousands had existed before the war. Many inhabitants had been deported in the weeks before the withdrawal, leaving reduced populations composed of those who had avoided forced labor columns, returned from hiding in surrounding forests, or survived earlier occupation measures. Local Soviet administrations, supported by military commandants' officers, moved quickly to re-establish basic governance. Their initial tasks included registration of remaining residents, burial of the dead in and around settlements, and allocation of surviving housing space. Food distribution relied on emergency stocks brought forward by the army and whatever supplies could be salvaged from cellars and outbuildings that had escaped destruction. Agricultural work had to resume despite serious shortages of draft animals. Many had been requisitioned or killed, and limited seed grain. Village councils coordinated the pooling of remaining ploughs and carts to ensure that at least a portion of fields could be sown in the coming season. The physical legacy of Operation Büffel and the Soviet advance also created lingering dangers. Mines left in former German positions and along roads continued to cause casualties among soldiers and civilians after the front had passed. Engineering units undertook systematic clearance operations, but incomplete records and the extent of the mined areas meant that accidents persisted for months. Demolished bridges and rail lines required sustained reconstruction efforts. Until these were complete, supply to the new front line depended on long, circuitous routes, increasing the cost and time needed to deliver fuel, ammunition, and food. In terms of military organization, both sides used the aftermath of the March fighting to adjust their structures. Soviet Western and Kalinin fronts reviewed the performance of armies and corps during the pursuit, the timing of artillery redeployment, and the effectiveness of logistics under conditions of rapid advance over devastated terrain. Lessons were drawn regarding the need for more flexible pursuit formations and better coordination between infantry, armour and engineers when confronting a withdrawing enemy. German 9th Army and Army Group Centre compiled evaluations of rearguard tactics, demolition schedules and anti-partisan operations conducted during Büffel, identifying which measures most effectively delayed Soviet forces without exposing withdrawing units to envelopment. Psychologically, the end of this phase carried mixed implications for soldiers. Soviet troops could observe the tangible result of advancing the front 130 to 160 kilometers westward and eliminating a salient that had threatened Moscow. But they were also aware that the main German forces had not been surrounded or destroyed. German soldiers, having completed a retreat that avoided a large encirclement, now faced the reality of holding a shorter line farther from the Soviet capital but closer to pre-war borders, with the expectation of further large-scale engagements later in 1943. By the close of March, the immediate consequences of the Gzhatsk breakthrough and Operation Büffel were clear. The Rzhev-Vyazma salient no longer existed. The front line had moved west. Large territories in the central sector had returned to Soviet control, and a wide belt of devastated land separated the new Soviet forward zone from the German defensive line. What remained unresolved were the broader strategic questions: whether the Soviet Union could, in the following months, build on this advance to break through towards Smolensk and beyond, and how the preserved core of Army Group Centre would be employed in the next phase of the war on the Eastern Front. In retrospect, the March 1943 Gzhatsk breakthrough and the associated Rzhev-Vyazma operation occupy an ambiguous place in the history of the Eastern Front. On one hand, the offensive eliminated a salient that had dominated the central sector for more than a year, advanced the Soviet front by roughly 130 to 160 kilometers, and returned to Soviet control key towns such as Rzhev, Gzhatsk, Sikhevka, Bailey, and Vyazma. On the other hand, the main formations of Army Group Centre, particularly 9th Army, avoided encirclement and destruction, withdrawing in a controlled manner to the Dukhovshchina-Dorogobuzh-Spars-Demensk line under Operation Büffel. The question of whether this represented a missed opportunity depends on how one weighs intentions, capabilities, and outcomes on both sides. From the Soviet perspective, the operation's legacy includes both achievement and limitation. The removal of the Rzhev-Vyazma salient reduced the threat to Moscow and simplified the geometry of the front, making later offensives towards Smolensk and Belarus more feasible. Soviet forces demonstrated an improved ability to coordinate multi-army operations, integrate artillery and armour, and exploit a withdrawing enemy. At the same time, the offensive underscored persistent constraints. Rifle divisions were quickly worn down to half or less of their nominal strength. Tank corps suffered heavy losses when committed against prepared anti-tank defences, and logistics struggled to support rapid advances over destroyed infrastructure. The casualty balance, about 138,577 Soviet losses in the March operation against approximately 15,000 German casualties in the 4th and 9th Armies, illustrates the cost of advancing without achieving encirclement. German command drew different conclusions. Operation Büffel is often cited in military studies as an example of a planned, large-scale withdrawal conducted without major encirclement, despite partisan activity and Soviet pressure. By shortening the front by roughly 230 miles and freeing 1 army headquarters, 4 corps headquarters, and around 21 divisions, the operation contributed to the pool of forces later concentrated for the summer offensive at Kursk. The successful escape of 9th Army from the Rzhev salient reinforced the view within German high command that carefully prepared retreats could trade space for time and manpower, even under unfavourable strategic conditions. However, it also meant relinquishing a forward base near Moscow and ceding to the Soviet side both political and operational initiative in the central sector. For civilians and the affected region, the legacy was primarily one of destruction and recovery. The combination of prolonged fighting, scorched earth tactics, and anti-partisan sweeps left towns and villages severely damaged. In Rzhev, Gzhatsk, and Vyazma, contemporary Soviet surveys recorded that only a few hundred buildings remained from several thousand pre-war structures, and that around 15,000 people were deported during the withdrawal. Rural districts showed high proportions of burned settlements and devastated agricultural capacity. Post-war memory in these areas focused less on the operational details of Büffel and Soviet pursuit than on the human cost. Destroyed homes, mass graves, and the effort to rebuild local life under conditions of shortage and trauma. The historiographical debate over whether the Gzhatsk breakthrough represented an almost encirclement of Army Group centers on assessments of timing and capability. Some analyses emphasize that, had Soviet command more rapidly recognized the scale of the German withdrawal and reorganized its forces for a high-speed pursuit, deeper penetrations towards Smolensk or into the flank of 9th Army might have been possible. This argument points to the initial days when Soviet units advanced into empty positions and suggests that earlier commitment of stronger mobile groups, combined with more aggressive use of air power against road junctions, could have increased pressure on retreating German columns. Other studies stress structural limits. Soviet armies in this sector entered March 1943 after continuous winter operations, with worn transport, limited motorization, and significant deficits in trained junior officers. Supply lines depended on railways and roads already strained by earlier offensives. The additional burden of moving artillery and fuel forward over destroyed bridges and mined routes constrained the tempo of pursuit. German planners, aware of these limitations, had designed Büffel to unfold before Soviet forces could fully reorganize from frontal assault to pursuit, and to integrate systematic demolitions that further reduced Soviet mobility. In this interpretation, the encirclement of a large German grouping in the central sector in March 1943 was unlikely given the available Soviet resources and the timing of the German decision to withdraw. Within the broader course of the war, the Gzhatsk breakthrough and Operation Büffel fed directly into the configuration of forces that shaped the summer of 1943. The Soviet advance west of Moscow and the elimination of the salient improved the strategic posture of the Red Army in the central sector, setting conditions for subsequent operations, such as the Smolensk offensive later that year. German preservation of the 9th Army and release of divisions from the salient, meanwhile, contributed to the concentration of armoured and infantry formations around the Kursk salient, where the next major German offensive would take place. The March operations thus influenced not only local front lines but also the distribution of forces at one of the war's pivotal junctures. In post-war memory and scholarship, the events around Gzhatsk in March 1943 have often been overshadowed by the more widely discussed battles of Stalingrad and Kursk. However, detailed studies of the Rozhevvyazma sector highlight this period as a key example of how operational decisions, planned withdrawal on one side, pursuit and attempted exploitation on the other, could reshape the front without producing a single decisive battle. The operation demonstrates that even when one side advances and liberates significant territory while the other retreats, the underlying balance of forces may change more gradually. For historians and military analysts, the Gzhatsk breakthrough remains a case study in the interaction of offensive intent, defensive adaptation, logistics, and timing. Ultimately, whether one views the March 1943 fighting as a missed Soviet opportunity or as a successful German preservation of forces depends on the standard used. Measured against the maximal aim of encircling large parts of Army Group Center, the operation fell short. Measured against the more limited but concrete goals of eliminating a dangerous salient and pushing the front westward, it achieved substantial results. For German command, Büffel did not alter the strategic trend on the Eastern Front, but did avert the immediate risk of a central catastrophe and provided resources for future operations. For the populations of the Smolensk region, the legacy combined the end of occupation with the beginning of a long reconstruction in a landscape profoundly altered by both the retreat and the advance.